So, the time has come for me to talk about perhaps the most well known uh, of the old school weird tales era pulp authors. The man, the myth, the maker of monsters, H.P. Lovecraft. I've read quite a few of his stories set in the Cthulhu mythos. This isn't actually the book I read. This was just the closest one to hand. In fact, I probably would have been better off reading this, but I didn't. Because I admit I have not actually read The Call of Cthulhu or some of the weirder ones, the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath or so on. Um, say what you will, he does a great job at coming up with these very evocative names. Uh, so I think right away I I was right off the bat impressed with his technical way of writing. It's very intellectual, surprisingly, uh, surprisingly highbrow for a man whose actual education was kind of all over the place. The voice of his characters is typically very strong. You get a good sense for how a character thinks and what they want. Uh, and as a general rule, they're different enough, I want to say, that they're not just the same character repeated over and over again, although at times it does come pretty close. They are typically well educated, though not always, right? That very upstanding of English descent, uh, which obviously Lovecraft was very interested in, very obsessed with. Although their intelligence and their education, I think, sort of leads them into trouble more often than not, because when a normal person sees a monster, they turn and run. But more often than not, we've got this guy who's, while he's running away, right, and screaming and terrified, he also stops to consider the implications that this monster has on the nature of humanity and the nature of the universe, right? It's a nice spot of existential dread that I'm sure Lovecraft had cultivated from a very young age. Um, and it's clear he's drawing on many of his own fears throughout his various stories. H.P. Lovecraft was a sick man. He is suffering at least from crippling anxiety, and who knows, he might have had other problems, and most likely did. It's hard to diagnose a man who's been dead for so long. But his obsession with madness, I think, might have reflected his own fears of losing his mind. I think people tend to forget that he was a real person in a bad situation, in the depression. And I think a bad combination of stress and mental instability caused a great deal of his more problematic qualities, uh, which I think tend to be sort of not really exaggerated, but turned into these funny anecdotes, right? Which sort of miss the fact and miss the point that he was, at his heart, a very sad man who happened to write some interesting stories which went on to inspire arguably greater works of fiction, uh, some of which survive to this day in myriad forms, both wonderful and terrible. Uh, and so I don't believe the entire works of Lovecraft can be discounted, uh, despite his obvious flaws as a person. Nevertheless, the great old ones and the outer gods and some of his creations are just astounding to read about. That is they're some of his greatest creations. Uh, we've got your boy Cthulhu, right? Dwelling in the depths of the sea, waiting for the stars to align so that he can rise from the deep and usher in the era of destruction and death and perpetual. Really, the way it's described uh, in some of the stories gives me the vibes that it's like just the world's worst, nastiest, most drunken like frat party ever, right? Uh, which is it's like perpetual mayhem partying uh, all the time, where everyone's indulging in their desires willy nilly, and there's just absolutely no restraint whatsoever, which is really weird for the the unknowable eldritch horror to be interested in. Um, but to be honest, Cthulhu, in my opinion, is really the least interesting of the old ones. Right? He's a big squid with bat wings and a little silly in some respects. Because then you've got Nyarlathotep, who's this trickster god, Slender Man uh, creature who turns into he can shapeshift into a pharaoh or a giant or a sea beast or anyone or anything. He is the crawling chaos, seeking to sow discord and madness throughout the world. Uh, and he's the kind of guy who would start a world war for the fun of it. He would encourage mass murder and serial killings and social upheaval of all sorts. He's a real danger, that one. Um, and there's Father Dagon and Mother Hydra, the monolithic amphibian fish gods who cause nightmares, and they lure their descendants into the sea to join them in their watery halls. Right? Um, yes, just in case you were wondering, yes, that is some drowned god nonsense. Uh, and George R. R. Martin was totally inspired by Lovecraft with all that jazz about kraken prophecies and fish monsters. Um, and anyway, there's just so many great horror stories throughout the mythos. The story of Azathoth, the great dreamer, right? Who might or might not be the creator of the universe. But the popular consensus is that when he wakes up, all life ends and everyone vanishes. Uh, and of course, my favorite of the great old ones, actually, he might be an outer god. I forget how the terminology adds up there. But Yog Sothoth, the key and the guardian of the gate, this lord of forbidden knowledge and knower of all things. Yog Sothoth is this phenomenal otherworldly creature that sort of exists in all times and places at once. Uh, I'd be willing to say he's probably the next best known of Lovecraft's creations. Whereas Cthulhu inspired like mind flayers and such in later works. Yog Sothoth has inspired your formless Odins and Hermaeus Moras and your flying spaghetti monsters. Uh, and I do get a kick out of this premise of the near omniscient being who really doesn't care about humanity at all. And like all the old ones are depicted as not caring about humanity. But Yog Sothoth really doesn't care about humanity. Uh, they're sort of an afterthought for him, except for when he needs to spawn an invisible shadow demon to. Actually, I don't know why he was interested in doing that. at all, really, but I'm sure he had a reason. Um, which leads me nicely to the stories themselves. While we're introduced to this cosmos of utter unreality and terror, the stories themselves have this painfully slow pace to them. Very slow, very careful. It adds to the horror. Uh, but I think I was at a disadvantage in that regard, uh, since I know from popular culture what was going on in pretty much every instance, every time, because I knew Lovecraft before reading him. Oh, I wonder what's in the barn over there. I hope it's not an invisible nightmare demon. Or gee, the people in Innsmouth sure are nice, and friendly. Uh, they're just so cool. I hope they all don't turn out to be gross fish monsters. Um, that said, Shadow over Innsmouth is still my favorite story. Um, Probably. With its whole the walls have ears attitude, right? So tense, and everyone feels like they're being watched, and it's just how strange and raving mad it is, right? From the old dude ranting about the sea captain who made a pact with the deep ones years ago, to how the main character gets attacked in his room in the middle of the night, seemingly at random. He's just passing through, or so it seems, when everything kind of goes to hell. And by the end of it, he's hiding in the bushes while priests of Dagon and Hydra and Cthulhu are marching up the road. I think the implication, by the way, is that Dagon and Hydra are sort of like vassals of Cthulhu, or like just a step below Cthulhu in the hierarchy, though it's not quite clear. Um, they go marching up the road in this procession of utter of utter horror. Uh, and the best thing about Shadow over Innsmouth, in my opinion, is the end, because I knew the story of Innsmouth itself rather well. I knew about the fish people and the cult of the deep ones. But what I didn't know was that slowly, once the main character escapes Innsmouth, he comes into contact with some old family history. He discovers at the Arkham University, because of course he does, that his grandmother was somehow related to the sea captain from Innsmouth, who made a pact with the Deep Ones, and perhaps her parents, and it goes back farther and farther. And then once he actually tracks down uh, his own family tree, he discovers that he has the blood of the Deep Ones running through his veins. Oh, the horror, right? He slowly, once he makes this realization, begins to notice that he is turning into a deep one, into this fish monster, taking on the Innsmouth look, right? With his wide, watery eyes, and this flat nose, and the wrinkly neck. And he knows he's going to lose his mind. He starts having these dreams and nightmares about Shoggoths and the armies of the sea, and about his deep one great great grandmother, who's still living beneath the waves and is encouraging him to come join her. Um, at first, he buys a gun and intends to kill himself, which is extreme, but the dreams get to him before he gets the chance to do it. Uh, so instead, he decides to run off to break one of his cousins out of a sanatorium, who happens to also be turning into a deep one, and then they run off to go and join their kin under the sea. Yeah, I was not expecting that. I had no idea any of that was going to happen, and it was fun. Uh, I I I like the works of Lovecraft. I think at times he can be a bit long-winded. The vast amounts of exposition had me grinding my teeth, and the phonetic accents of certain characters are just well, they're not good. But it is worth reading Lovecraft, I think, without a doubt. and just for the surprise of Innsmouth, I would have been happy. Uh, because that was a great twist. I didn't see it coming at all, but I think there was enough information there uh, so that it didn't come out of the blue per se. The narrator mentions his cousin in the sanatorium and his odd family tree, but doesn't make the connections until much later. Uh, so yeah, um, H.P. Lovecraft. It's probably better than you think if you haven't read it. I, I I like it because you know, darling, it's better down where it's wetter, under the sea. Up on the shore, they work all day. Out in the sun, they slave away. Down here, we're devoting full time to floating under the sea.